Hello, everybody, and welcome to Backfired, an NBA history podcast about bad teams, bad luck, and bad decisions. My name is Lewis, and today we are going to discuss Doc Rivers, but not his propensity or his proclivity to blowing 3-1 leads or his coaching decisions, his throwing his players under the bus, nothing like that. Doc Rivers, the executive during his time with the Los Angeles Clippers. Many people already know this, but in addition to being the head coach of the Clippers from 2013 to 2020, he was also the head of the Clippers basketball operations department for part of that time in a couple of different roles. And there's a semi-famous ESPN segment featuring Amin Al-Hassan where Amin breaks down Doc's decision-making process in a very funny way. And I wanted to run with that analysis, but also go a little further in depth than Amin went. So I broke each trade and each free agent signing down into a few different groups to analyze how Doc doled out the Clippers' money. And I'll be honest, this is sort of an anecdotally related topic to the main thesis of the show. You could put it in the bad luck category because it is the Clippers, or the bad decisions category because the teams that Rivers built were good, not great. This isn't totally an episode of Backfired, but, we're just having fun here. I do have future plans for, I don't know if it's going to be in a separate feed or what, but episodes like this that aren't 100% within the scope of this pod. But maybe this can be like a preview of that. For now, I'm just going to say that this is part bad luck and part bad decisions, and then just retcon it later. Now, before we get into it, let me just do what a couple of my friends have told me that I need to do, which is plug the socials a little more aggressively. At Backfired NBA Pod on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram are the show accounts. At Logic Master with a 0 in place of the O is my Twitter. Check it out. Follow those. Follow the pod on whatever platform it is that you're listening on. Tell a friend about this podcast, please. I would be super grateful for that. I've also had some really good conversations with listeners, so please reach out if you want to talk more about the topic or give feedback or something. So Doc Rivers had a pretty long NBA career. He was drafted in the second round of the 1983 draft out of Marquette, and he played most of his career for the Atlanta Hawks. 8 years in Atlanta, a year with the Clippers, a couple in New York, and then most of his final 2 seasons in San Antonio. And he was pretty good. He was an all-star in 1988, averaged a double-double with points and assists in 87, and is still the Hawks franchise leader for total assists, a mark that Trae Young will probably take in the next 3 years or so. But after Doc's time in the NBA, he was a pretty hot commodity. He retired from the Spurs in the summer of 1996, and a few months later was hired by Turner Sports to call games as a color commentator alongside Vern Lundquist, replacing the outgoing Danny Ainge, who had spent 1 season calling games before getting the nod to replace Cotton Fitzsimmons as the head coach of the Phoenix Suns. So Doc called games for a season, and then like Ainge, he had an opportunity before him. In the 1997 offseason, he was a serious candidate to replace the Milwaukee Bucks outgoing general manager, Mike Dunleavy. And his name was also in the news for head coaching jobs in Vancouver and Golden State. Rivers and the Bucks allegedly came pretty close to a deal, so close that Peter Vasey, who was kind of like Woj in the analog era, a big newsbreaker, Vasey actually reported on it for the New York Post as a done deal. But in the end, he asked for a 5-year, $5 million contract, and the Bucks owner, who was U.S. Senator Herb Kohl, told the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel that they mutually decided that it wasn't a good fit for the time being. And actually, I got the minutes of the negotiations through a FOIA request, and Doc apparently asked to be paid in Kohl's cash, which I think is kind of strange. Doc then decided that he would still pursue coaching. The Vancouver Grizzlies allegedly offered him their head coaching job, but again, they couldn't agree on salary. For the next few years, his name was thrown around a few times for various positions. He was considered for the Toronto Raptors GM position after Isaiah Thomas left town. He was mentioned to be a possibility for the Spurs head coach job if Greg Popovich wanted to focus on being the GM only. But every time that there was a rumor, he quashed it, saying, he was happy doing TV. Soon enough, though, there was an opening that he really liked the sound of, and that was with the Orlando Magic, replacing the bad boy Pistons head coach Chuck Daly, who had spent 2 years in Orlando and now was going to be an advisor for the Vancouver Grizzlies prospective owner Michael Heisley. And Rivers told the Orlando Sentinel, quote, "I wasn't ready back then, but now I've been away as a player for 3 years. I've gotten a different perspective from doing television, and I'm ready to do what I've always wanted to do." And while Rivers didn't have any coaching experience, he was a natural leader as a point guard. And he said that he had soaked up a lot of wisdom after playing for Larry Brown, Mike Fratello, and Pat Riley, who are some of the best NBA coaches of all time. So the Magic hired him. They had gone 33-17 in the lockout shortened 1999 season under Daly before a disappointing first round exit, and they were in the process of revamping the roster completely. So they would trade away Horace Grant, Nick Anderson, and Penny Hardaway shortly after hiring Rivers. And then after going 41-41 in the 2000 season, the Magic got 2 out of their 3 white whales. They traded for Grant Hill and Tracy McGrady and missed out on signing Tim Duncan as a free agent. For the remainder of Rivers' time in Orlando, Grant Hill would suffer from an ankle injury, which is going to be a future episode. He really struggled with that. But the team made the playoffs for each of the next 3 seasons with McGrady, but never advanced past the first round. Then after a 1-10 start to the 2003-04 season, Rivers was let go from the Magic and spent some more time on television before accepting the Boston Celtics job in 2004. After 3 fruitless seasons, Celtics executive Danny Ainge, moving on from being the Suns head coach, traded everything he had to combine Paul Pierce with Ray Allen and Kevin Garnett, which essentially made Boston winning a championship a fait accompli. Rivers was at the helm, but 3 of the league's best players did most of the work to will the Celtics to the championship over the Lakers. After that championship in 2008, Rivers was the Celtics head coach through 5 more playoff runs, losing to his former employer, the Magic, in 2009, the Lakers in a finals rematch in 2010, the Big 3 Miami Heat 2 seasons in a row, and then finally his aging roster crumbled in the first round against the New York Knicks in 2013, which was the only playoff series that the Knicks have won since the year 2000. And say what you will about Danny Ainge, but he did see the writing on the wall and squeezed every ounce of value out of the assets that he had in 2013. Not only did he completely bamboozle the Brooklyn Nets by dumping the corpses of Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett for several first-round picks, he also executed the rare coach trade to get a first-round pick out of the Los Angeles Clippers. And here is where the meat of this episode begins. The Clippers traded their 2015 first-round pick for the right to hire Doc Rivers in the summer of 2013 after the Chris Paul and Blake Griffin pairing under head coach Vinny Del Negro had come up empty 2 postseasons in a row. Not only would Rivers be the head coach of the Clippers, but he would also be the senior vice president of basketball operations and later the president. Despite being outranked in the Clippers org chart by the general manager, who was Rivers' longtime assistant coach Dave Wohl, that title gave Rivers the final say in all basketball decisions, according to Gary Sachs, who was the vice president and later assistant GM whom Rivers leapfrogged in the org chart upon his arrival. And as the Amin Al-Hassan bit that I alluded to earlier claims, Rivers did have a certain tell for when he was going to pursue somebody. And this wasn't every contract he gave out or every trade he made. But the thing was that you could draw a pretty clear line to a certain game or a certain series in the past where a given player did really well against a Rivers coached team or simply played for the Celtics under Rivers. So I'll give you some examples before I go super in depth on this and talk about the groups that I split up all these players into. So first off, here's a guy that you probably have never heard of, and that is Lester Hudson. And if not for a couple things, I never would have heard of him before this either. But he is from Memphis. He played college basketball at the University of Tennessee at Martin, which is a small state school near where I grew up in the middle of nowhere. And he was the first and only D1 men's basketball player to record a quadruple double. He's also a star player in the Chinese Basketball Association. He's won a few international MVP awards, tons of all-star appearances. But in the NBA, he's pretty much a nobody. He's played a total of 57 games in the NBA, and the only significant playing time that he's gotten was for the Cleveland Cavaliers when Kyrie Irving missed a couple of weeks in the 2012 season. And in that time, he averaged about 15 points per game, but it was on a bunch of shots, and the Cavaliers went 3-7 in that stretch. After that, he played 3 games for Memphis and then went back to China for 3 more seasons. And the only person to give him another shot in the NBA after he had proven that he just wasn't an NBA caliber player was Doc Rivers, seemingly just because Rivers had coached Hudson before in the 2010 season. And here's another example, Josh Smith. Do you remember the game where Josh Smith and Corey Brewer combined for 29 points in the fourth quarter of a playoff game to keep the Rockets alive, and then eventually overcame a 3-1 lead to beat the Clippers? That was on May 14th of 2015. And then 2 months later, Rivers inked Smith, who really didn't have very much left in the tank at that point, to a league minimum contract. Now, it is the minimum. It's not the worst signing in the world, but it is just one of many examples of Doc signing a guy who went off against him. Also, this being the best deal that he could get made Josh Smith kind of channel his inner Latrell Sprewell. He didn't choke Doc Rivers out, but he did tell the LA Times, quote, "I do have a family, so it is going to be a little harder on me this year, but I'm going to push through it and, try to do something long-term after this year." This was when Josh Smith was famously being paid over $5 million per year by the Detroit Pistons after they waived and stretched the remaining 2 years of his big contract. So his income after adding in the league minimum was really about $7 million per year. I hope his family survived that year of austerity with Josh only making $7 million after years of making 8 figures. My heart goes out to them. So these are just 2 examples of this phenomenon going on. And I'm sure there are other coaches turned decision makers who let this bias their decisions a little bit, but none of them have this reputation that Rivers earned. So I'm going to go through every acquisition Rivers made when he was calling the shots in LA, from the day that he was traded for to the day that he stepped down as the president while retaining his role as the Clippers head coach. So first off, the grading scale. I graded all these transactions from 0 to 5. And this can sometimes get a little tenuous and is definitely subjective in some instances. So, if you have a disagreement on one of these, please let me know what you think. But my overall goal was to just get a final proportion for each of grades 1 through 4. And that'll make more sense in just a minute. So I'll start with a grade of 5. That is re-signing an incumbent Clippers player. I'm not going to count that in the final calculation, for reasons that should be pretty clear. A grade of 4 is a past his prime former really good or great player. So like Steven Jackson, he lit everybody up, not just the Celtics, but when he was on the Pacers, they did beat the Celtics in the first round in 2005. A grade of 3 is what I call a strong connection. And this is the one that kind of is the variable of interest here. Is this one much higher than we might expect? Now, I have no idea what a baseline percentage, would be for this, because I haven't done this analysis with every decision maker. So there's no defined null hypothesis or anything. We are just kind of freeballing it here. But, again, we're just having fun here. But an example of this one is former Celtics players and players who had like a career high in scoring or a triple-double or something like that, an outstanding performance against the Celtics or the Clippers that would stick out in Doc's mind. So an example of this would be Paul Pierce, who, of course, Doc coached for his entire Boston tenure. A grade of 2 is a mild connection. So I could find something that might be something that anchored itself in Doc's mind about this player, but it probably wasn't, a major consideration. So take, for example, Spencer Hawes. He played for the 76ers for a few years, and they matched up with the Celtics in the playoffs in 2012. That is, by the way, the series in Uncut Gems. Hawes wasn't great in that series, but he was a starter. He didn't have any standout performances that made me think that Doc was like, oh, that's the guy that I want on my team. Then a grade of 1 is no real connection. So, for example, Chris Douglas-Roberts, sometimes you just have to sign the players who are available. And then a grade of 0 means that that person never played for the Clippers at all. So like the 5s, I'm just throwing them out. So for example, Miroslav Raduljica was salary fodder in a trade. He got waived 3 days later. He's not going to get counted because he wasn't like the target of a transaction. He was just kind of a number on a spreadsheet. So without further ado, here we go. I'm going to start with the 2013 offseason and go in chronological order. Reggie Bullock. This one isn't really on Rivers because the 2013 draft was just a couple days after Rivers was officially acquired. But just for fun, I'm grading this one as a 2. And also, I'm going to put the key in the description of this episode just in case I went through everything too fast, but you'll get the hang of it pretty quickly. I graded this one a 2 because Bullock played for North Carolina and Doc's son, Austin Rivers, played for Duke. And given what we've heard about, the nature of the Doc Rivers and Austin Rivers relationship and, Doc's busy schedule as an NBA head coach, Doc probably only watched a handful of Duke's games the year that Austin was there. And, the place that you'd start is UNC versus Duke. That's must-see TV. And Austin did hit a game winner over UNC in 2012, and Reggie Bullock played in that game. Realistically, the Clippers, probably knew that they might pick Bullock before Doc came to town, but it's still real to me, damn it. JJ Redick was acquired in a 3-teamer with the Bucks and the Suns. This one is a 3. Redick, of course, was a very good player, but specifically against Boston, he'd averaged 18 points per game against the Celtics the prior season, and the Orlando Magic, which were Redick's original team, beat the Celtics in the playoffs in 2009. So, hey, the Magic were good enough to beat Doc's team. So if Doc got a player from a better team, naturally that made his team better. To get Redick, Doc traded away Eric Bledsoe and Caron Butler, both of whom played well against Boston the previous year, but Caron Butler was expensive and Bledsoe was up for an extension. And, they already had Chris Paul, so they didn't really need Bledsoe. Jared Dudley also came in the deal that gave them Redick. He had played well in a win over Boston in 2012, but Redick was, the crown jewel of the trade. So I'm giving this a 2. Re-signing Chris Paul is a 5. Signing Darren Collison as Paul's backup. Collison was Paul's backup in New Orleans briefly as well. He had a career average of 15 points per game against Boston and scored 25 points against Boston the game after his career high of 27 points. So in my book, that is a 3. Byron Mullins, a free agent in 2013, put up 25 points and 18 rebounds in a win over Boston when he played for the Charlotte Bobcats. That's a 3. Steven Jackson, as I mentioned before, just a generally great player against everybody, but was older now, so I give that a 4. Sasha Vujacic was a 2-time champion with the LA Lakers, including a finals win over the Celtics in 2010. So that is a 3. Antoine Jamison, like Steven Jackson, was a great player in his day, played well against everybody, but this wound up being the end of his career. So that is a 4. Moving into the 2014 offseason, we have Glenn Big Baby Davis.
That's your boy, Big Baby, man.
He played for the Celtics from 2007 to 2011 and was on the championship team in 2008, so that's a 3. Danny Granger was a big scorer and an all-star on the Pacers, who just generally went off against everybody. That's a 4. And then the rights to Cenk Akyol, he never played for the Clippers, so that's a 0. Now the 2014 offseason, a lot of transactions this summer. Carlos Delfino and Miroslav Raduljica both instantly waived, so they were the return for Jared Dudley, who was salary dumped to the Bucks. Those are both 0s. Spencer Hawes, as I mentioned in the examples before, was a 2. They signed Epe Udoh, who was on the Bucks during Rivers' final year in Boston. The Bucks won 3 out of 4 games against Boston, so that's a 2, kind of a tenuous connection. Drafted CJ Wilcox. Draft picks are typically going to be a 1. Signed Chris Douglas Roberts, who was just a replacement level player. He's a 1. Hedo Turkoglu, just generally a good player, but like Redick, played for the Orlando Magic, who beat the Celtics in the playoffs. That makes him a 3. And I meant to mention this before. The former players rule is players who played for Doc on the Celtics specifically, because he never signed any of his former Magic players. I don't think very many of them were still in the league, even at this time. Moving on, Jared Cunningham was just a guy, so a 1. Joe Ingles, famously cut by the Clippers before playing a regular season game, so that makes him a 0. 2015, during the season, the Clippers made a couple of trades. The first was Cunningham and the rights to Cenk Akyol for the rights to Sergei Lishuk. He never played. That's a 0. Dante Jones is going to be a 3 because he did score 25 points against the Celtics while playing for the Pacers in 2009. His career high was 26, so just one more point. And Dante Jones was classically not a scorer. He was more of a defender. Then Austin Rivers, that's a 3, not because he had necessarily had a good game against the Celtics or the Clippers, but, that's his kid. Jordan Hamilton had 16 points against the Clippers in February of 2014, which was his highest scoring output as a Houston Rocket. That was certainly unexpected, and that earns him a 3. Nate Robinson was a Celtic, as was Lester Hudson, so they are both 3s. On to the 2015 offseason, Lance Stevenson, who was a member of the best recent Indiana Pacers teams and the Charlotte Hornets, he put up 22 points, 12 rebounds, and 6 assists in a win over the Clippers in 2014. That is a 3. Brandon Dawson, just some guy, that's a 1. Wesley Johnson, not a bad signing, but, no real connection. That's a 1. Re-signing DeAndre Jordan is a 5. Signing Paul Pierce, despite him being a past his prime former great, most importantly, he was a former Celtic, which puts him in the 3 camp instead of 4. Re-signing Austin Rivers is a 5. Cole Aldrich is a 1. No real standout games against the Celtics or the Clippers. Josh Smith, who we already mentioned, was a 3. Pablo Prigioni was a New York Knick in 2013, and they beat the Celtics, so that's a 3. He had a career-high 14 points in the closeout game of that series. Chuck Hayes and Nikolos Skidishvili were training camp bodies who never played for the Clippers, both 0s. And then Luke Baamute, who was not a scorer, but he had 20 points against the Celtics in 2013, which is 2 off of his career high. That earns him a 3. Mid-season in 2016, there were a handful of transactions. Marty Lunin never played in the NBA, so it's 0. Jeff Ayers came over from the Spurs, whom the Clippers had played in the playoffs the previous postseason. And the Clippers won, so that's a 2 instead of a 3. But that probably would have been a 2 regardless of, the outcome of that series, because Ayers really didn't play much for the Spurs. Jeff Green, a former Celtic, that's a 3. Doc traded away Lance Stevenson and a first-round pick to get him. And then Alex Stevenson, he would be a 0, but he did play 4 games for the Clippers, averaged 3 minutes per game, so that's a 1. On to the summer of 2016, pretty eventful. No major additions, but just a lot of transactions. Bryce Johnson, a draft pick. He did play for UNC, but it was after Austin Rivers was gone, so that's a 1. Diamond Stone, a draft night trade, another 1. They re-signed Jamal Crawford, Luke Baamute, Austin Rivers, and Wesley Johnson, so that's 4 5s. Maurice Spates played against the Clippers in 2014 while on the Warriors. The Clippers won. No major performance from Spates in that series, so a 2. Devin Marble, I was kind of torn on what to go with for this one. I wound up giving him a 0 because he never played for the Clippers, but his dad, Roy Marble, did play with Rivers on the Hawks in 1990. Maybe Doc's doing his old buddy a solid there. Brandon Bass, a former Celtic, that's a 3. Raymond Felton, like Pablo Prigioni, played for the Knicks in 2013 and beat Rivers as Celtics, another 3. Alan Anderson, just some guy, a 1. Xavier Munford and Darrell Wright never played for LA, so 2 0s. Tyrone Wallace was the lone acquisition during the 2017 season, and he had never played in the NBA before, so that's a 1. But Tyrone Wallace was actually pretty good. That was a good signing. And then in the 2017 offseason, which was Doc Rivers' last in control, there was a trade for Sindarius Thornwell, who had never played in the NBA before, so that's a 1. Well, then one of the final acts of Doc Rivers' executive tenure was when Chris Paul opted into the final year of his contract to facilitate a trade to the Houston Rockets. And in return, the Clippers received Kyle Welcher, DeAndre Liggins, and Darren Hilliard, 3 guys who never played for the Clippers, so that's 3 0s. Sam Decker, a 1. And then the meat of the return was Patrick Beverley, generally just a good player from a good team, so a 2. Montrezl Harrell, he's in the news. Boy, isn't he? Potential future episode topic, Montrezl Harrell, by the way, depending on how his recent drug arrest shakes out. But he had a career-high 29 points against the Clippers a few months earlier, so that's a 3. And then Lou Williams, who, he's Lou Williams, a great scorer. He beat everybody up. But he did play against the Celtics in the 2012 playoffs when he was on the 76ers. His general scoring ability earns him a 3. Then Jawan Evans, who was essentially a draft pick, so 1. Danilo Gallinari was brought in via trade. Fantastic player. He averaged a hair under 20 points per game against the Clippers for the previous 3 seasons, so that's a 3. Milos Teodosic, another game for Milos. He had never played in the NBA before, so he's a 1, but he certainly had a great pedigree coming in. Man, we love a guy who rips cigs in the locker room at halftime. Re-signed Blake Griffin, that's a 5, and then signed Jameel Wilson and Willie Reed, both 1s. Now, after omitting all the 0s and all the 5s, we're left with 49 transactions. Of those 49 transactions, 17 of them had no major connection, they were 1s. 7 of them had a mild connection, they were 2s. 22 of 49 had a strong connection, those were the 3s. And 3 of them were the old guys who used to be good, and those were the 4s. So that's 35% 1s, 14% 2s, 6% 4s, and a whopping total of 45% with a strong connection to Rivers in some way, either a former Celtic or a guy who went for a career high or was on a team who beat the Celtics or Clippers in the playoffs. And that is a lot. That's almost half. Like I said, I don't know what the baseline would be, for coaches turned execs, but nearly half of the players having just recently gone off against his team or having played for him before is certainly higher than I would have expected to find just by random chance. But does that mean that Doc Rivers is a bad executive? Not necessarily. What made him a bad executive was that very few of the signings and trades that he spearheaded really made an impact on the court. So by my count, maybe 10 out of the 49 guys that Doc Rivers signed or traded for made a meaningful impact on the court. A lot of the moves were just salary dumps, draft rights for a second-round pick that barely played, moves around the margins. Not really talking about the value of the cap space generated by the trades or the opportunity costs of not extending or choosing to re-sign some players, purely just the players that he put out on the court. Doc Rivers pretty much relied on Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan, JJ Redick, and then Matt Barnes or Austin Rivers until after the Chris Paul trade. And that shows a weakness in the roster because it was so top heavy and reliant on 2 really injury prone players in Chris Paul and Blake Griffin. And if one or especially if both of them went out, we saw that they were screwed because they didn't have quality depth like some other teams. Now, obviously, you want Chris Paul and Blake Griffin caliber of players, but after the Paul trade, the teams with Danilo Gallinari and Lou Williams and Tobias Harris, those were really deep teams. They didn't have as high a ceiling, but, that's a balancing act that you kind of have to live with. But Doc holding the coaching and team building responsibilities at the same time made him a prisoner to himself in 2 key ways. First, the coach Doc Rivers was limited by the roster moves that the executive Doc Rivers made. And second, the executive Doc Rivers received a disproportionate amount of feedback from the coach Doc Rivers. And as the Clippers owner, Steve Ballmer, told ESPN, quote, "The notion that one person can fairly focus on coaching and team building and give them both the attention they need isn't the case. To be as good as we can be, to be a championship franchise, we need 2 functioning, strong people building teams out beneath them. There needs to be a healthy discussion and debate with 2 strong, independent-minded people. They're different relationships that a player needs to have with the coach and with the front office." And I completely agree with Ballmer there. I think most owners have started to figure out that consolidating the coach with the GM or the president just isn't the way to go. It typically ends pretty badly, I'd say. So unless I'm missing somebody, which I don't think I am, the only current head coach who is also a team president or a VP or a GM is Greg Popovich. And obviously he is very, very good at both roles. Some recent examples other than Doc and Pop of people who shared both roles were Mike Budenholzer. He did a great job of turning a Hawks team that he coached, but somebody else mostly assembled, from a 60-win team to a team that needed to tank. Tom Thibodeau, it was the Wolves, but he did bring in Jimmy Butler because of a sentimental attachment to him. Obviously, he's a great player, but that move wound up setting the franchise kind of on fire. And then, of course, a cornered Stan Van Gundy made the Blake Griffin trade to try to avoid getting fired from both jobs to no avail. So, yeah, the recent history of the hybrid job isn't very good. And I'm sure someday the league will swing back and there will be a ton of people who have total control. But I think it's in the league's best interest right now for it to be the way that it is. So think of Doc Rivers as a cautionary tale, because it seems that with him being stretched kind of thin in two different roles, he went with guys that he knew or guys he had seen at their very best. And that is anchoring bias or confirmation bias or something like that. It's some sort of cognitive bias. But after being relieved of his duties as the president of basketball operations, Doc did keep his role as the head coach for another 3 seasons, coaching 2 massively different iterations of the team than he had before the Chris Paul trade. One was the one that I mentioned before. It was the plucky group of guys who are mixed in with the old team. Blake Griffin, of course, was traded, very surprisingly, to the Detroit Pistons shortly after signing a big contract. DeAndre Jordan was still there, but Gallinari and Pat Beverly, Tobias Harris, Montrezl Harrell, Lou Williams, and eventually Shai Gilgeous-Alexander made up a team that had really good vibes for the first time in a long time. You know, the Chris Paul teams, as I mentioned in episode 3 of this pod, were always a little tense, but the new group was honestly really fun. And as somebody who is kind of a Clipper hater myself, that was the least hateable Clippers team that I can remember. And then in 2019, the landscape of the league, shifted completely as the Clippers were now yet another top-heavy team with Kawhi Leonard and Paul George in town. In their first season with that pairing, they beat Luka Doncic and the Dallas Mavericks in the first round, but then blew a 3-1 lead to the Denver Nuggets in the second round, which was the third such embarrassment in Doc's career. And after that, Doc left LA for the 76ers, which is a story for another day. But thank you so very much for listening. I really, really appreciate it. Wrapping up here, again, please follow the show on Twitter or TikTok or Instagram or any combination of those. Tell a friend or your worst enemy about the show. Reach out to me if you want to chat about Doc Rivers or any of the past or future episodes. I have an ever-growing list of topics that I'm really excited about, and I hope you'll stick around to hear more of them. All right, have a good one.
Welcome to the Clippers. Get a $sign right there.
Ching.